Okay, welcome to the podcast, Lem's Universe of Hapless Space Pilots and Fairy Tale Robots, commissioned by the Polish Arts Festival in Limerick to mark the centenary year of Stanisław Lem. This podcast will explore a universe of hapless space pilots, mad scientists, and fairy tale robots, and show you why Lem should be your new favorite sci-fi writer. Polish Arts Festival is a community initiative that started 13 years ago and grew to be a significant event on the Irish cultural scene. This year's festival theme is Looking Up and Looking Out, referring to opening our horizons out onto broader themes and opening our eyes and hearts to welcome artists and audiences from further afield and developing a multitude of collaborations, partnerships, and participation. My name is Kamil Chechlacz, and I will be your host today. I'm delighted to welcome here with me Jack Fennel, a lecturer at the University of Limerick and author and sci-fi enthusiast. As a matter of fact, a new book by Jack is coming out this winter. And this book is called It Rose Up.
It Rose Up.
It Rose Up, and it is a collection of stories, fantasy stories, kind of forgotten, kind of lost
Exactly.
by Irish authors. It's a combination of occultism, electricity, magic, and playfully biblical archetypes. And Jack has edited and introduced the book, so we highly recommend that you take a look at that. Jack, welcome.
Thank you very much, Camille.
Now, it's a funny thing because I come from Poland and Stanisław Lem is from Poland. And I do recall reading as a boy some of the Lem's short stories. But I come here today to learn about Lem from yourself. Because, first of all, I'm super interested, how does he transcribe to a, not a Polish language speaker, so through a translation. So is he an author that people abroad can also enjoy? And I believe they do, because 30 million copies sold around the world or something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
But also, tell me, why would you choose Lem? What is so specific about him?
Honestly, it's his humor. I mean, he is such a funny writer, such a witty, insightful writer as well.
But Solaris is not kind of super funny thing, so people kind of think it is usually quite gloomy, right?
Yeah, they do. They think he's the author who created Solaris, and there's been a couple of film adaptations of that, and it's all very reverential, and the talk around it is very critical and very intellectual, and people hear that and they go, oh, he's a bit intimidating for me, I'll stay away, he sounds a bit intense. And by doing that, they kind of miss out on shorter stories like, the Siberiad or Fables for Robots or the Eon Tihi series. And I think that's an awful shame, because, it's in his short stories where he shows off his incredible wit and his incredible insightfulness.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading Fables for Robots, and it's an interesting combination of putting robots in sort of a medieval type of a scenario of stories. Can you tell us a couple of examples of those stories? Is there any particular story that you liked from Lem's work?
Well, like that universe, it's kind of, as you say, it's set up in like a fairy tale kind of universe where all the characters are robots. So there's princes, there's princesses, there's knights, there's dragons, and they're all robots.
Okay.
And human beings are in there somewhere.
Okay.
They're kind of there in the background. Nobody really cares about them. They're kind of squishy, disgusting things. We don't really want to deal with them, kind of thing. But in that universe, then, a lot of the stories focus on a pair of scientists or magicians. They're kind of in between. Robots as well. And they're called constructors. Mm-hmm. And they have... Now, this is another thing that Lem does. He gives characters quite complicated names. So these guys are called Kaplosius and Trurl.
Okay.
Trurl, if that comes across. And most of the stories that hooked me when I started reading them are about these two guys, usually inventing something that gets out of hand, and then they have to invent something else to try and solve the problem.
Okay.
And probably my favorite story is The Dragons of Probability, which is, it goes into all this ongoing debate about, everybody knows that dragons don't exist. I mean, that's a boring thing to say, we know that dragons don't exist. We have to decide how exactly they don't exist, right? So you have all these robots having debates with each other about which types of dragons don't exist more than others. And eventually what happens is that Kaplosius and Trull build a machine that actually makes dragons possible. And now all of a sudden dragons do exist. They're all over the place and they have to figure out a way to get rid of them. So that's my personal favorite, but there are so many others in that series.
I mean, it kind of makes me feel to start reading Lem again, but those stories, and especially I like the fact that you mentioned Lem's humor, which is often forgotten. There is a whole series of characters that are kind of funny, and they're never like superhero types, right?
No.
Comparing to all I think off record we were talking about American sci-fi from that time. When the people were always winning, they always knew what they were doing, Superman types.
Exactly, like Buck Rogers, Dan Dare.
What is the character that Lem has created as a response to that?
Well, he's created two, but the one I'm going to start off with is probably better known, Eon Teehee, who is a space pilot who gets into all kinds of ridiculous situations by accident. And then gets out of them by accident again. He's not remotely in control of his circumstances, no matter where he goes. So, for example, in one story, his spaceship hits a meteor, and there's a hole on the outside of it. And this is the type of damage that needs two people to fix. And he's in the ship on his own. Luckily for him, he goes into a time warp. And other copies of himself start showing up. So there's one from yesterday, there's one from tomorrow, there's one from next week, and so on. And they keep multiplying. So does he team up with himself to fix the damage? No, of course not. He won't do it. He's too stubborn to cooperate with himself. Right? And it just gets more and more ridiculous from there. So that's the kind of adventure that Eon Teehee gets into. The other character that
Sorry, and Eon Teehee, the title of books for where he...
Oh, yes. The collection of Eon Teehee stories, I think there might be a couple of them, but the one that's most famous is the Star Diaries.
Okay.
Which is, I think there's an English translation available from Penguin and other things, like there's an audiobook as well. And the other character, the other series character that he has is Perks the Pilot, P-I-R-X, Perks. I'm not sure how that's pronounced, but this is a bit more grounded in sort of real world physics, but it's about a guy struggling to do the best he can. He's not an expert. He's not an authority on anything. He's a middling student. Like the very first stories we see of him are him in school, and he's daydreaming. He's not paying attention in class. He's at the bottom of the class, but at the same, he just has a natural sort of ability for space piloting. And, he just kind of gets into scrapes, and then he has to kind of think his way out of them. So he's a bit more grounded, but very much in the same kind of mode. These are not supermen. These are not...
They're real people.
They're real people in extraordinary situations.
Fantastic. I mean, this is something... So we have Star Diaries to put on a shelf for a character that's really out of ordinary. And then more ordinary character is Perks the Pilot. And is that the title of the series as well? Or
there's Tales of Perks the Pilot, and I think there's another one called More Tales of Perks the Pilot. So very straightforward.
Quite easy to find. Yeah. Very good. It's a funny thing because Stanisław Lem has created this whole world, and he was very philosophical as well, right? We spoke about it off record, and you can find it in all the texts about him. But he also kind of was treated, at least in some circles, as a visionary. Some of the technologies that he mentioned, and he was giving them a very interesting names as well.
Yep.
Some of the technologies that he mentioned, people claim that he was a visionary who, for the first time, imagined the internet, imagined the virtual reality, and the nanotechnology, right?
Yeah, totally.
Do you have any examples of that? Do you remember the names of those technologies that he has created?
It'll take me a few minutes to remember, I think, because he comes up with these amazing names for things that are about 700 syllables long. And, he loves wordplay and he loves the sounds of words and such. But I would definitely say, that he anticipated the internet, he anticipated nanotechnology. He visits the theme of nanotechnology in a couple of his novels and in a couple of stories as well, where nanotechnology, like nanites, tiny little microscopic robots, tiny little microscopic machines, somebody invents them, they get loose, and all kinds of chaos ensues. And a lot of his stories, like they're set on planets or they're set in societies where everything is kind of interconnected through an information sharing network. So yeah, I would absolutely say that he did anticipate those things, that he saw those things coming along.
That's super interesting. Like there's obviously more writers that could do that, and they were writing about things that were about to happen. Is it based in the fact that those writers, and this is more generic sci-fi question, to be a good sci-fi writer, you obviously have to follow scientific discoveries and be invested into that, and then you build on that, right?
Yeah.
So I remember again from reading about Lem before, he especially liked one American author of his his time, right?
Yes, he did. He was a big fan of Philip K. Dick, who, if you've never heard of him before, you might have heard of the films Blade Runner and the sequel to that. And, he wrote the novel that was based on, and, a whole bunch of other things as well. Philip K. Dick was probably the only American author that Lem actually liked or thought was any good. Unfortunately, Philip K. Dick thought that Lem was actually, a gang of 6 KGB agents who were out to kidnap him. And, he was a little bit concerned about that side of things. So unfortunately, they never had a fruitful correspondence.
That's super interesting. But if you think about Lem from a perspective, again, kind of more generic perspective, how did this happen that a writer from Poland, and at the time, for people that don't know, and some people may not know, Poland was behind the Iron Curtain, and Iron Curtain meant basically that part of the world, a huge part of Europe, was kind of disconnected with the other part, and it was due to politics and so on. We won't be going into details, but the thing was basically it was difficult to communicate between East and the West of Europe. But somehow Lem's work kind of made that jump, that leap across the Iron Curtain. And why do you think it happened?
I think that, the obvious answer is that it's just about how good his writing is. That there's somebody who could speak Polish and English, obviously read some of it. Well, Lem himself could speak English. But somebody read his stuff and just said, this is absolutely amazing. Regardless of the Iron Curtain, they said, this is a phenomenal writer. The other thing is, and you might correct me on this if I get it completely wrong, but sci-fi was much more closely monitored on the eastern side of that divide than it was on the west. Because certainly in America and in the West, it was kind of treated as, it's not proper it's not proper literature. It's only rubbish kind of thing. There's no serious political message in that. Whereas on the other side of the divide, people were a little bit more alert.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think I can't really comment on whether sci-fi was particularly part of it, but definitely any writing, any creation was subject to censorship because of the, and again, not diving into politics too much at the time. Poland and Eastern Europe was under communist regime, and anybody that would criticize the communist regime would be in trouble. But a lot of very good authors and artists managed to do it through a very metaphoric ways. And in fairness, I believe in Lem's work you can find this type of writing as well, where you kind of basically, I think in Fables for Robots there was a couple of things where he was basically showing a totalitarian regime in a way, and it still made its way. Maybe because the censors didn't really get his humor. And,
that's the other side of it. Yeah,
you know, and he could hide it. But do you think Lem's work have influenced Irish writers at all? Like, did it make a connection here? I think we spoke about it.
We did, and I went looking for anyone who directly referenced Lem, and unfortunately, like, nobody seems to actually claim him openly as an influence. But he has been, like, every time a translation of his work was released through the 20th century and up to the 21st, it was reviewed in the Irish media, and it always reviewed like very, very favorably. We've had critics here compare him to Jonathan Swift. They've compared him to Flann O'Brien. They've compared him to all these kinds of literary geniuses and saying, like, please give us more of this. You know, and, like, people who are into their literature and who are into their sci-fi, they would know him by name. I mean, he might not be a household name here, but those who are tuned in are big fans of him.
So among other things that we mentioned, Lem had also treated about aspects of apocalypse. How did he portray, and what sort of apocalypse did he first and foremost wrote about?
Well, when you think about, like, apocalyptic stuff in sci-fi, I mean, it's normally some big earth-shattering cataclysm, like there's one coming out in a few weeks' time about the moon crashing into Earth or something like that. But like, Lem doesn't write that kind of apocalypse. His apocalypses are like the breakdown of information, right? So like there's an Ihon Teehee story where he ends up destroying all the digital information on planet Earth by accident. As usual. There's a novel called Memoirs Found in a Bathtub, which is set on a planet very much like ours, except it's kind of like before they've developed digital media, so everything is still on paper. And then something happens that causes all the paper on their planet to disintegrate. So all of their stored information is just wiped out. And like, there is no big physical cataclysm. There's no meteor from outer space or anything like that. It's just information is taken away, and it destroys their society completely. Like, it causes like an immense amount of damage, just taking away knowledge, taking away data, taking away that ability to look stuff up. So, that seems to be where the apocalyptic side of his imagination was more geared towards. Like, I mean, anything else we can kind of recover from, but the destruction of information, the destruction of knowledge is something that will like linger, and it will leave long-lasting damage that we might never get over.
Yeah, well, it could be quite big, especially nowadays. I'm not sure. Well, we all got used to even getting here. We were checking Google Maps, and imagine this didn't work, right? All of a sudden you had no information. But then, obviously, my view on that is that people did survive back in thousands of years ago by passing on information verbally. So I think we could recover from that to some extent, and if all the information in the world right now got destroyed, it could be a positive thing as well.
Well,
very, very things that we don't really want to know.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff out there that we think is information, but it's just not true.
It's trash, basically.
So throwing that out might be a good thing.
Yeah, there was actually something called Lem's Law, right?
Oh yes, I'll see if I can remember the exact formulation now. That those who read don't understand. Those who read and understand soon forget.
Yeah. There's one more
there's
part.
another part of it.
And I'm not being clever here because this is what Jack had sent me before this recording. So, Lems Law, nobody reads. If they read, they don't understand. If they read and understand, they immediately forget.
Yes.
Does it apply to a lot of people nowadays? I mean, hopefully not, but I may know people like that.
It certainly applies to me. I forget everything. I have a head like a sieve.
Well, you didn't seem to be forgetting a lot of things during this conversation, Jack. So, other authors. Okay, we spoke about Lem. This is Lem Centenary. We have mentioned this beautiful spaces, the beautiful worlds he created, fairy tale robots, pilots, and stuff like that. But perhaps there are people out there that don't know Lem but know other authors. So if you were to choose a couple of authors or, works of popular culture that are out there, and if people like those, they might like Lem, who would you choose?
Well, we've already mentioned a couple of them. So Jonathan Swift, Flann O'Brien, and Philip K. Dick. Definitely, if you're into any of those guys, you will probably love Stanislaw Lem's short fiction. Other writers include Isaac Asimov, obviously, because Isaac Asimov has like a much more optimistic, a very different view of what robots can be to Lem. It'll be fun to contrast those, I think. In terms of popular culture, I mean, there's an episode of that TV show Futurama, which is just a straight adaptation of one of Lem's stories. The episode is called Fear of a Bot Planet, and it is basically the story we were talking about before, where everybody's, a human in disguise. It's a riff on that. And also, as well, I'd say if you're into Rick and Morty, I think you'll probably get a kick out of Lem as well. Because, Rick and Morty is all about, we are not actually significant. We're just kind of part of this universe like everything else. And, there's an episode, I think, where one of the characters, I think the dad, Jerry, like he's left to his own devices on an alien planet where he understands nothing. And like the aliens that are trying to deal with him are getting cranky and they're giving out to him and he doesn't understand why they're angry with him. And all this, like things like that, I'd say. I mean, if you get a chuckle out of that, you will definitely appreciate Stanisław Lem.
Brilliant. His work is not only sci-fi, obviously. I don't know if you've read anything of his that is not really sci-fi. Do you have any examples of works like that?
Well, he did write a good bit of philosophical work, which it's quite dense and it's difficult to track down. So again, this is one of those things I only know by reputation. But he was a philosopher before he was a writer. I think before he was a fiction writer, he had ideas that he needed to kind of get down on paper and explore. And before he was a science fiction writer, he also wrote like an autobiographical trilogy of novels based on, his experiences as a student, I think, and, weaving in some of his day-to-day.
It was something with the High Castle. I don't remember now the title.
Something to that effect. Again,
High Castle. It was called High Castle.
It was called High Castle, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
And I only know it because I read about it yesterday. Sorry, I haven't read it. But I'm sure it's going to be something interesting as well as the fact that Lem apparently was reviewing non-existing books.
Oh, yes. This was another... Again, this is like one of those things that if you're into Flann O'Brien, you're probably going to really like Stanislaw Lem because like they have a similar sense of humor. And one of these things is Stanislaw Lem's history of reviewing non-existent books. Right? So there are collections out there of his book reviews for books that do not exist, where he kind of takes these fictional writers to task and he gives out about them and he's praising some of them and he's castigating others and saying, how dare you write this? It's not real. But obviously he's using these in order to make bigger points about certain topics. They're kind of like the things that he wanted to say about people who hadn't said those things yet, I think. He wasn't going to wait for somebody to write the book that he could then criticize.
Right, Jack. I mean, all these things about these great writers, Lem, and your vast knowledge in the field. I mean, how did it start? I mean, I'm asking about this moment. When you were a little boy and you first picked up something sci-fi. What happened?
Right, I guess I would have been about 6 years old, and one of my aunts was visiting from America, and she had like a paperback sci-fi book with her that she probably bought in an airport before she came over to while away the time, and she left it behind when she went again. And I think it was like the cover of an Anne McCaffrey. It was an Anne McCaffrey book or something, and the cover was one of these really detailed paintings, and it was a desert planet. There's a spaceship that's just after landing in the distance, and there's people walking around surveying everything, and in the foreground there's a thing that's like half man and half cat, and it's kind of looking over the hill surveying them.
That's
And they don't know that they're being watched. And I picked that up when I was 6 years old. The book was too advanced for me, but I just was entranced by that image, and like I was ruined ever since. And then Star Trek came along on television, and there was Star Wars as well. Like I got into all of that stuff. It was like I was hooked early.
Brilliant. So like, when did Lem enter the
Lem
field?
Lem was quite late, I think, because I remember picking up an encyclopedia of science fiction when I was about 13 or 14, because I wanted to see who all these different writers were. And there was a section in there about Stanisław Lem, and like it started off talking about like what a deep thinker he is and how philosophical his work is, and he's the genius intellectual author of Solaris and what have you. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, he sounds a bit tough for me. I think I'll leave him and I'll come back to him later. And then I did come back to him later. I must have been in my 20s, and I saw a copy of the Siberiad in a library, and I picked it up and I just read it just so that I could say that I had read some Lem. And I laughed my butt off from one end of that book to the other, and I was kicking myself that I didn't pick up some of his work earlier.
That's amazing recommendation. I mean, obviously, I can imagine a kid nowadays having fun with his writing as well. But obviously, we've already said. I mean, you did explain that Lem is not all philosophical and gloomy and whatnot. But he can be a serious writer. He can actually touch on very serious topics, and he talks about humanity and with the backdrop of meeting other civilizations, about communications and that.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about that part of his work?
Well, yeah, and this goes back to what we were talking about with his heroes being like the polar opposite of what the American heroes of the time were. At the time, I mean, everybody assumed, okay, we're going to go into space and we're going to meet these aliens, and we're going to establish trade with them, and we'll all be part of one big interstellar community. And Stanisław Lem was saying, well, why do you think that would happen? These are aliens. They don't think like us. They're aliens. It's the clue is in the definition. So obviously, like Solaris, his most famous novel, is about an encounter with an alien creature. It's basically an ocean on a planet. It's an entire planet that is conscious, and it has these incredible mental powers that people don't understand. And humans kind of orbit this planet for ages trying to figure out what this thing is thinking, and they just can't, because it does not think like a human being. We cannot understand that kind of mind. And it kind of goes to the heart of what science fiction was. We thought that our science fiction kind of takes for granted this idea that the world revolves around humans. And Lem was like, no, it doesn't. Like, it does not. Like, I mean, we are just like one thing in the middle of a vast universe. If there are other beings out there, they don't have to have anything in common with us.
Yeah.
Like they can be anything. Like so, a lot of his books.
We may
also,
have met aliens already and don't realize that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Totally, we could have.
Yeah.
For all we know, there might be one in the studio here with us that we can't see just because it's like it's completely invisible. So and a lot of his books also like they just take for granted the idea that robots could have evolved on their own. Like they don't need people to build them. Like we think, robots are things that we create, and those videos of the Boston Dynamics robots that are doing parkour around a gym, and for some reason we need robots that can do that. But easily no. They're like, the robots in Lem's universe, they just kind of evolved on their own. Nobody built them. Nobody programmed them.
They have princesses and dragons.
And they have princesses and dragons and kings and queens and such.
But it is it's a big word for some younger listeners. Anthropocentric. So we build robots based on how we perceive movement and everything else and stuff like that. But as you just said, this anthropocentric approach, according to Lem, is nonsense. And you've mentioned a couple of titles of books that he kind of treats about this specifically, right? Off record, you mentioned that to me. Can you name those books for listeners so they can actually pick up the copy and realize Solaris is one of them, but what were the other ones?
I'm going to have to refresh my memory. We can hopefully chop this out in the editing stage.
Yeah, The Man from Mars, Magellanic Cloud, Eden, Solaris, and Fiasco.
Yes. Right, so there are some examples of books like that include Fiasco, The Magellanic Cloud. There's a couple of novels like that. Not all of them are translated into English, which is unfortunate. So I only know some of them by reputation. But in all, he approaches the subject of first contact, right? This like the first contact between humanity and an intelligent alien species. It's one of these things that like every sci-fi writer has tried their hand at. He has revisited that theme a couple of times, and it never kind of goes smoothly. Like there's always some miscommunication. There's always some failure to connect. Like it's not a simple thing in Lem's work. So like Fiasco in particular is a fairly again, this is one of those gloomy works as well, but it's about this attempt to establish contact, and it kind of ends tragic in Fiasco. Exactly.
Yeah, well, so, it is an important lesson if we had to take one lesson from Lem's work, from what I understand, is the fact that, the world does not circle around humans. We're not the most important part of the universe. For a lot of people, especially in this time of Lem, when we discussed that, those superheroes and people kind of conquering the universe, we maybe conquered ourselves and even not notice that or anything like that.
Yep.
Obviously, this is a subject of a lot of sci-fi films and books. But the term robot that came up, I don't know how many times in this conversation.
Probably.
It is a very common term. Where is that from?
Well, the word robot, it was actually invented by a Czech writer, Kamil Chechlacz, for his play RUR, or Rossum's Universal Robots. And it's derived from the Czech word robota, meaning forced labor. I'm sure there's a Polish
exactly
equivalent.
The same word.
Exactly the same word.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
So that's essentially what it is. It's derived from forced labor.
Right. It's amazing how one word from one part of the world was picked up to this extent. It's kind of like household term now. Right. So if you were to choose three of the Lem's works, and let's say if we were to actually recommend something to younger listeners and to maybe more advanced sci-fi and to more mature listeners, what would you recommend to the younger listeners to read?
younger listeners, I would recommend the Siberiad or Fables for Robots. I think it's like a lot of the English translations kind of combine those into a single volume.
All right.
But Fables for Robots, definitely. And maybe, if you're a little bit older, then try the Siberiad and, just get into these stories of like mad robots kind of hammering each other and kind of going on epic quests and such things like that. Maybe if you're a little bit older than like a young adult stage, maybe, that might be a good time to read the Eon Tihi series. Again, like, they're short stories and they deal with a lot of the themes that we spoke about before about, anthropocentrism and what have you. But they're done in a very kind of enjoyable way. It's not going to be like doing homework, right? You're going to be laughing while you're exploring these ideas. And then, for the more hardcore sci-fi enthusiasts who are kind of looking for something to kind of really hurt their brains or what have you, I would say, definitely read the book of Solaris, because the films leave out a lot.
Okay.
And they kind of glide over certain important things. The book is a very different experience. It can be quite tough going in places, but it also kind of brings in facets of the story that maybe you haven't come across before. And that's all I'll say of that, because I don't want to,
of course,
spoil anything.
Just to add that Lem himself didn't really enjoy the films based on Solaris.
No,
he wasn't happy. He was very demanding in terms of interpretations of his work. Just before we finish, is there anything else? Because I remember a story about Sapulka,
Yes.
kind of a trivia type of a thing.
Yes.
What was that?
This is like a word that, now I don't know if Lem actually invented this word or if he just adapted it from the Polish language.
I don't know.
But he has a story about Eon Tihi going to a planet to gather information about the people who live there, and he's trying to figure out what this one particular thing is, and he knows that it's extremely important to the local culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has one, everybody needs one. Society would not work without them, but you're not allowed to ask anyone what they are, because that's considered extremely inappropriate. So he's walking around talking to all these aliens, and he's like, excuse me, what exactly is a Sepulka? And they're all like horrified. They're like, how dare you? How dare you ask me that right out here on the street? And he kind of eventually he comes to this conclusion that's like, okay, if I'm going to figure out what these things are, I should probably just get one. So he goes into a shop and he goes up to the counter and he's asking the two aliens behind the counter, excuse me, I'd like to buy a Sapulka. And the two clerks are going, oh yes, of course, we see, sir. We'll be very discreet about it. And where is your wife right now? And he's going, I'm sorry, I'm not married. Get out! And they kick him out of the shop and they hound him away. So, like, the meaning of Sepulka is never discovered. Like, spoiler alert, it's never discovered, right? So it entered into sci-fi terminology as like this thing that's incredibly important, but you're not allowed to ask what it is. And there was even, I think there was a group of Russian sci-fi fans, I think, who came up with an award called like the Golden Sapulka, which they gave to Lem initially, and I think they gave it to a couple of other authors after that. But
brilliant. That's an amazing world he's created, and they, like, again, I'm sorry, I mean, this probably will be a bit of a spoiler again, but those Eon Tihi stories, there's another one you mentioned before we went on record, about the planet that people crash landed there, and what happened there?
Oh yes, the robots. Yeah. This is again, like, we're talking about robots here. Like, this is another Tihi story where he is sent to a planet where like a maniac computer has taken over, right? This is a computer that has absorbed the memoirs of Jack the Ripper and like a bunch of other horrible stuff, and it has become a psychopath. And it has conquered this distant planet with an army of robots, and every time Earth sends people there to try and negotiate with it, they never come back. So Teehee is sent there to figure out what's going on, and he's disguised as a robot to keep himself safe, right? He's there inside a robot suit. And when he gets there, he's quickly arrested and exposed as a human being, and he's made to swear an oath of allegiance to this computer in exchange for his life. And as he's going around on this planet, he begins to figure out that there are no robots on this planet. Everybody there is a human in a robot suit. And they've all come from Earth. They have all sworn allegiance to this computer. And they're all just hanging out there living as robots because they can't go home now because they've betrayed Earth. Like, there isn't a single genuine robot on the planet. And then he demands to see this computer, and he kicks down the door of the castle where the computer lives, and he goes in, and he just finds this little bureaucrat sitting there filling out forms. And he's like, yeah, this whole thing was a test to see who would crack and who would betray Earth.
And this is, again, this you can easily see Kafka there, and you can tell it's coming from some experiences from behind the Iron Curtain in terms of bureaucracy and
definitely,
people kind of hiding their real nature because of the system, because the system requires from them to actually comply, and and with the Sepulchers as well, like, nobody asks certain questions, and
you're just expected to know.
So like, if you ever plan to become a writer, you really there's no other way of I do believe, at least, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you observe your own reality and you kind of transcribe it. And you just put it a couple of years in advance, or a couple of 100 years in advance, or on back. Yeah,
and some people they stop noticing stuff when you do that. So you put in robots and you put in rocket ships, and people stop paying attention. It's great. As well as that, like, I mean, there are rumors that. And I don't know if this has been confirmed now, but that Lem was writing like an explicitly political opera. That he was putting together an opera just in his spare time. And he never published it, and he never performed it, or he never had it performed. He used to perform it to his friends in his own house, right? And it was very explicitly anti the communist regime, and very satirical and very kind of openly critical, which is why he never had it printed or published.
Right, that's super interesting, because obviously he survived the communist regime. So
he did.
I wonder how true are those rumors.
I don't know. I would love to see it.
Oh, me too.
If it does exist.
So to any researchers out there who are listening to us, find that, please, and publish, or at least put it on stage for us. Jack, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, Kamil.
Thank you to the Polish Arts Festival in Limerick for inviting us, and it has been a huge pleasure talking to you, Jack. And
likewise,
there is a lot more to explore about Stanisław Lem and sci-fi in general. I myself am becoming a sci-fi fan over the years now, more and more, finding this to be a fantastic way of diving into how the society works, with a little backdrop of either robots or anything else. So we do recommend you guys to take a look at your nearest library or bookstore and pick up a couple of copies of Lem works, and hopefully it will have you hooked up in sci-fi literature for longer.
I'm sure it will.
Thank you so much, Jack, and thank you to the festival, guys. Have a great day, night, or whenever you're listening to us. Thank you.